Hi, everyone, and welcome to the second episode of Life, the Universe, and All the Rest. And I'm really, really excited today because we have a very special guest for a new second season because we used to be The Blind Spot and now we've changed the name, but it's the same stuff, just better, you know. And so we have today Michael Pollan, and we're so excited to have him. I'm just going to invite Evan to introduce him properly. Thank you.
Yes. So I imagine that Michael Pollan doesn't need very much introduction. He's a celebrated journalist and author of numerous books, most recently, A World Appears, which is about consciousness. And he's a professor at both Harvard and University of California, Berkeley. So welcome, Michael.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Thanks for joining us. I thought I would open with a very, very big picture question about your writing, about your journey as a writer. And that is you started out, if I'm correct, you started out writing about food. And then if you look at your book titles, at a certain point, all of them have something to do with the mind. So there's Botany of Desire and Your Mind on Plants and How to Change Your Mind, which is about psychedelics. And most recently, A World Appears, A Journey into Consciousness. That's the subtitle. So I'm interested in what was it that led you from food and into mind and then eventually now most recently into consciousness. How did that unfold for you?
Well, the path makes a little more sense if you go back before the food books, because my first book was called Second Nature, and this came out back in I don't even remember when, late '90s maybe, a long time ago, and that was a book about gardening and plants and our relationship to nature. And the thread that carries through, I think, is this interest in plants and how humans have, we have this weird relationship to nature. We have a relationship to nature, which is ridiculous, but that's how we feel, right? We're inside it, we're outside it. And I've been interested in those questions for a long time, and I've been passionate about plants and all the different things plants do for us. So if you take the garden as kind of the initial laboratory where I like to both work, and one of the reasons I chose the garden is I thought it was underexplored. I mean, Americans interested in nature always go to the wilderness, right? We've got a great tradition, John Muir, Thoreau, and in our own time, Edward Hoagland, all these wonderful writers. But I thought that the wilderness offered certain things, the idea of untouched nature, although it seldom was actually untouched. But the garden offered something we needed more, which was a way to engage with nature without destroying it. So anyway, I got very interested in those kind of questions, and and a very obvious move from gardens to agriculture. I mean, you're dealing with the same issues, right? Of fertility and pests, and getting food off the land without damaging it. And then I got very interested in the all the other ways that plants gratify our desires. And in Botany of Desire, I looked at that's when I really started thinking about the mind, because there was that's about four plants that domesticated plants that we changed profoundly, but they changed us too. And I was looking at that symbiotic relationship, and how plants essentially manipulate us to get what they want. I mean, in the same way they manipulate bees and mammals that eat their seeds and things. And so I looked at four human desires that plants had evolved to gratify. And one, of course, is changing consciousness. And in that book, I looked at cannabis as a case and got very interested in that really, when you think about it, strange and seemingly maladaptive desire to change consciousness, which I think is a human universal, beginning with kids who like to get dizzy, and
Yeah.
obviously with, simple things like caffeine and alcohol. It's just kind of who we are. And many animals like to change consciousness too. So that, exploring that, why would that have why didn't evolution get rid of the drug takers, basically? It
Yeah.
should, because they're accident prone,
Right,
things
right.
bad things happen. But it must have some utility, because it has survived. So that's kind of the path. One of the things plants do is change our minds, and for their own purposes. All the books are kind of about transformation in one way or another. I'm very interested. I realized in transformation in retrospect. So yeah, I mean, but the mind has become more central. I think you're right to observe that as time goes on. Sorry, that was a very long answer to your
No,
question.
it's great. It's great. So would you say one of the themes in your most recent book, but you've also written about it before, is plant intelligence and plant sentience? And would you say that that idea was always maybe it could just be intuitively, not necessarily formulated fully, but was it always kind of lurking there in your thinking about plants, the idea that, well, plants affect our minds, but maybe they are minded in their own way?
Yeah, I didn't go quite that far. Initially, the form of plant intelligence was a kind of species intelligence. So, you have these orchids that are brilliant at mimicking the sexual organs of bees to get bees to mate with them or think they're mating with them. I mean, there's this a lot of genius in nature but it's at the species, uh, adaptation level. When I started writing about plant intelligence, and I wrote a piece about it in the New Yorker back in 2014 or 13. That was a kind of different intelligence. I mean, it is evolved, but it's on the individual level. I mean, how individual plants respond in ways that it's hard to imagine are programmed in their DNA. I mean, that they're dealing with unpredictable events, and that kind of got me more interested. But in this book, which is about consciousness, and the focus really is human consciousness, I thought it would be helpful to kind of break down the problem a little bit by looking at a simple case. And not, human consciousness is so complex and layered, has all these bells and whistles that lots of other creatures don't have and that aren't necessarily central to the idea of it, that I thought, well, let me start with something simple. And I could have started with insects or, I don't know, reptiles or something, but there was this work going on in with these scientists who were actually, considering this question of consciousness. And it led me to kind of focus on a distinction between sentience and consciousness. But I should mention here how influential all three of your work has been on my book. I mean, reading The Blind Spot and interviewing Evan and Adam had a really profound effect on how I thought about it. And the idea that Evan's written about biopsychism, that some kind of simple form of sentience is perhaps a property of life, was very persuasive to me, and also a license to take seriously what a lot of people don't take seriously.
Yeah, it's interesting to me to notice that that some of the reviews of your book, I think what it was Ned Block maybe who reviewed it for Science. So that's exactly the idea that they have problems with, right? Is, Ned says something like, well, plants just respond like thermostats, which, I think all of us would say is not at all what plants do. But it's
Yeah, I think you just have to look very closely and look at the particular experiments to realize that in a world that is as unpredictable as it is, that hardwired responses will only take you so far. And that was that was an important understanding. I had this idea, oh, all these other creatures have instincts and we have intelligence. And but what is an instinct? I mean, instinct implies something that's completely hardwired, and it implies you could program everything that could happen to a plant or us. And I think that's hard to believe, that you need. And Michael Levin was very influential on this. The Tufts biologist, that what evolution creates are these cognitive beings that can respond to a world that's always changing, and the idea that the DNA could take care of everything is far fetched.
Yeah, that seems like a dead idea now that, the selfish gene and the gene is just a program and there's nothing else happening. It seems like, from epigenetics, there's so much evidence that which genes get triggered at which points is so much context dependent. So yeah, it really seems that
Yeah,
that.
and
But
Levin's done these amazing experiments by essentially creating these new life forms, these xenobots, which he
right,
creates from the cells of tadpoles, and they get together, these tadpoles, in a nutrient broth and form a new entity that has behaviors. Um, and both in its form and behaviors, there's the DNA has nothing to do with it. So what is leading to that that creation of form and behavior? And he has some pretty wild theories, but you can't attribute it all to either environment or DNA.
And the whole point of what you said, they get together, right?
Yeah, I
What
know.
what is that?
Yeah,
Why
why?
do
I
they
mean,
do
he
that,
says
right?
it's because there's obviously strength in numbers, and so it's a defensive reaction that if we'll get picked off individually, but if we join together, and
But
that's
to know
driving.
that, that's knowledge, right? I mean, that's some
Yeah,
sort of knowledge of
some sort. So where does it come from? And his current thinking, which is pretty wild, and I think is really threatening to push biology to a new place, is that there are these platonic patterns, and he uses that word, that would, that uh, create the patterns for things like purpose or goal directed behavior. And that these just exist in the same way that mathematical ideas just exist. And that I think the weird verb he uses, which comes from Whitehead, is we ingress these patterns,
Mhm, mhm, right.
manifest them in the world. And I mean, who knows? But it's interesting. But I mean, some of you, I mean, you guys are two of you are physicists,
yeah.
and physicists are open to pretty wild ideas because you don't really have a paradigm that's really working for everybody. But biology has thought it had one,
Right.
and thinkers like Levin are kind of, pushing it.
It's an old tradition in biology, that idea actually. It just got submerged by the rise of Darwinism and molecular biology. The idea of what would be called rational morphology in the history of biology, that there are these invariant patterns and laws of form, to use Darcy Thompson's expression. He
yeah,
wrote a book
right.
that was published in the 30s or 40s, called Laws of Form, or on growth and form, I think. And other biologists, developmental biologists like Waddington, who worked also, or was very influenced by Whitehead. So there is this kind of like alternative tradition in biology that's interested in form and pattern, and just like Levin and also Stuart Kaufman, who have emphasized these ideas. But they very much were, now they're emerging again, but they were submerged by the rise of molecular biology and neo-Darwinism in the 50s and 60s. So it's
The
interesting to see.
reductionists, they're
Yeah,
essentially
the
that
reductionist, yeah,
reductionist mindset that like it's
exactly,
all
blind
just
spot
genes.
biology in our
Yeah,
Yeah,
terminology, right?
right, right.
So, it's
that's
interesting
interesting.
to
I
see
wasn't
that.
aware of that. I have Darcy
Yeah,
Thompson's book on my shelf, but I've never read it. I should
it's
check
a
it out.
it's a fantastic book. It's a
Yeah.
beautiful book. Yeah, yeah. So there's a pretty obvious, I suppose, pathway from, your book on psychedelics to your book on consciousness. And the book on consciousness, I could see like opening into all sorts of different future things, given what, you write about and what we were just talking about, life and pattern. And I wonder, like, do you feel that consciousness is kind of a summary of all of the things, like a distillation, or do you feel it's just like opening a whole new doorway of future work?
I don't know what that future work is, but yeah, I think it does. I mean, it was a really hard book to write.
Mm.
I was stymied at many points and
Interesting. Why was that, if you
frustrated.
don't? Yeah, why was that?
Well, that the science, all the theories start hand waving at a certain point. When you
Mhm.
get to the
All
True.
of
concept
that.
bit,
Exactly. Good.
and I thought we knew more,
Right,
and
Yeah.
that's
You thought
kind
you
of
were going to get to the end, in a
I'm
sense.
sorry.
Did you ever think you would get to the end? I'm going
Oh,
to.
no, and I didn't know how I was gonna end, and, thanks to Joan Halifax, she really gave me an ending. Um,
The
But that's
cave.
like,
The cave was the ending. That's
the
where all
cave
right.
roads
was
lead
the
to the
ending,
Cave.
cave.
but that took a big mind shift because I was really looking at things in a very conventional problem solution framework, and accepting that the hard problem was the important thing to focus on. And it started with my wife, actually, at the when I was getting very frustrated with all the science I was learning. um, she's an artist. She's not a journalist, and has so brings a very different take to things. And she's a painter, and she would say, there's a lot of positives about not knowing,
Not
and
Exactly.
knowing.
and that it opens you to mystery, it opens you to possibility. And she deals with not knowing. She doesn't know where the next brush stroke is going to
Yeah.
go. She doesn't have a plan when she paints, and she's responding to what she's seeing. It's really a practice. And I was like, yeah, 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 yeah. You can't hear that from your wife. And but then when it was confirmed by Joan, my time in the cave, and also a long interview I had with Jory Graham, the poet, which ended up just being a sentence in the book. But she's a very wise woman, and she she teaches poetry at Harvard, or did. And her challenge as a teacher of poetry is not teaching them rhyme schemes or anything, but getting them to be more conscious,
Mm.
and that they're
Wow.
not. They're kind of checked out. So she has all these wild exercises where she makes students spend like an hour a day with a particular tree, and observe everything they can about it, which students find incredibly difficult. And I've tried it in my students, and they can't do it. They end up invariably focusing on, like, so and so kissed so and so under the tree. So it's social information, not
Yeah.
botanical
Not
information. They
the
never
tree
even give
itself.
you the species. But so she's, and it's really the basis of her work, and many poets' work, is to make people more conscious, because we check out, and we can. We have the luxury of all these technologies and civilizations that allow us to be less conscious than animals are, who have to be present all the time. So that was a real shift, moving from the scientific discussion of the hard problem to, no, consciousness is also a practice. And Buddhists understand this. And so that was a shift. The other shift, of course, that goes on in the book is it moves from discussion of the science of consciousness toward the humanities.
Right,
And
right.
because I realized at a certain point that novelists are experts on consciousness too.
Yeah.
Right, right.
What they're telling us, we know more about Madame Bovary's consciousness than do about most people in our lives. And so I got a lot out of talking to novelists and poets. So people think of it as a book on science, but that's only part of the story.
But I think the notion of the not knowing is really essential. I think and write a lot about this stuff because, as scientists, you're always trained to think that intelligence is about solving problems, right? And you get to the answer. The smart guy is that the one that cracks the answer, get an A, and that's wow, that guy's a genius, right? And it turns out that it doesn't seem to work that way for certain classes of problems, right? Which are, I call them the unknowables.
Yeah.
And the origin of the universe, the origin of life, and the origin of mind or consciousness, to me, are three questions where embracing this notion of we do not need to know the answer to learn more about the mystery of this, and kind of embrace the mystery as part of the excitement of being alive, and understanding that this, because we always this, I think the tension comes from this hyper focusing that we are forced to go into. When you're solving a problem, is about focusing on that problem, right? Perhaps the problem of consciousness perhaps is forcing you to go the other way,
Yeah.
Mhm.
and that is so hard for scientists.
Yeah, and not knowing is generative. It leads to more questions, and often, as you know, as scientists, solving the problem is often a question of rephrasing the question, right? And it's the way we're asking the question that gets us stuck. And I mean, you guys make this point in the chapter on consciousness and blind spot, that we've accepted this framing from David Chalmers and others, but maybe it's not the right framing.
Mhm. Yeah. And Milan Kundera, in his Bearable Lightness of Being, he has a quote that is kind of like, the hardest questions you can ask are the questions that children ask, because oftentimes they are questions that have no answers. And because they have no answers, they push the boundary of what we try to deal with, in ways that aren't expected, right? I mean, the why kind of thing. And I love that, because it brings this kind of purity to these very difficult questions that you engage with, and that's probably why it was for you, writing the book, there was this transition from let's think of this as a focused scientific problem and where are these guys getting there, right? To maybe that's just not the way to do
Not
it.
the way to do it. Yeah.
Hmm. Yeah, when you started writing, I'm interested. When you first conceived to yourself, okay, I'm going to write a book on consciousness. Did you have the sense that, oh, I'll get my answer in neuroscience, or I'll get my answer in, I don't know, biology? Did you
Or
think of it?
AI, or
Or
right.
AI, whatever.
Yeah,
Yeah,
right,
because
right.
I know you have a background in the humanities, or did you already sort of have the feeling, well, I might get some information, but consciousness is awareness,
It ain't
life,
gonna be that way.
meaning, and
Yeah,
so
you're
it's
Yeah.
gonna
not,
get an answer.
I'm not going to get those kind of answers. Like, how did you?
Well, it's funny. This book was a genuinely open quest when I started. I really didn't know where I was going. And that's a measure of, I have a wonderful editor, or had. She recently died.
Oh,
She died actually on the day this book was published.
oh dear.
And her name is Ann Godoff, and she's a brilliant editor. And we've worked together for 10 books. I mean, I have a very unusual
Mm,
publishing career.
wow.
And she has a lot of faith in me, and more than I have. And when I said I was interested in consciousness, she was like, go for it. And my proposal must have been 2 pages of bullshit, but it was
I'm
enough.
gonna write a book about it. It'll be great. Yeah, yeah.
And
Signed
so I
Michael
had no
Pollan.
structure, I had no destination. It genuinely was a journey. And that's a risky thing to do as an author, and it made the project take a lot longer. And I'll never do that again because it was painful at various times. But so it was very open ended. I thought I would get more from science than I did, but in all my books, I'm thought of as a science journalist, but I don't think of myself that way. Science is one vocabulary or one way of knowing that I look at. But if you go back to Botany of Desire, I really like rotating around a subject and looking at it scientifically, but also historically, memoiristically, um, psychologically. And I just find when you multiply lenses, you get a richer picture of things. And so if you look at Botany of Desire, there are these breaks. I'll do 1,000 words and it's all about botany, and then I'll do another 1,000 words and it's social history of the tulip
Yeah,
or something like
yeah.
that, or economic history of the tulip. And I like doing that. I like playing with different ways of knowing and contrasting them one to another. So I knew that I would not just do science in this book, but I didn't realize just how important both artistic and spiritual ideas would be
Hmm.
in the process. And it's not to say I didn't learn anything from the science. I mean, I did. I think this whole shift in focus from consciousness being a function of cortical thought, to this emphasis on feelings and affect, um, is very productive, and it has huge implications, because if you think of consciousness as embodied, you think about AI in a different way. But I guess it was Adam mentioned AI. AI was not on my radar when I started. It wasn't really until ChatGPT, and which comes out 2022, that I realized, oh, I have to deal with this. This is important to the conversation. And Blake Lemoine's, the episode where he reported that Lambda, the Google chatbot, had personhood, and that became an important part of the book. Like, well, what are the implications of this for consciousness? And I think, I do think AI will teach us some interesting things about consciousness. It might be the most interesting research direction, even though that's not the goal of it. But these people trying to build a conscious AI I think they'll fail, but in failing, we'll learn something.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting point. Also, I just wanted to say also one of the things I've always loved about your books going all the way. I think the first book I read of yours was Botany of Desire. How much, it seems like you're just going on a journey and you're inviting me, because I read a lot of science books by science journalists, and your work always seems so different because it was like, I'm interested in this thing, here I go. Come on along with me, as opposed to like I'm reporting, I have some question in my mind and I'm just going to go ask people and report. It always feels like I'm coming along with you from all these different lenses. But that different lens thing is, I think, something really important because I think one of the most interesting things that happening because of AI is that now suddenly questions about consciousness are sort of at the forefront. Like your book, there's huge interest in your book, but also because consciousness it's so the reductionist kind of approach, it's just circuitry to me, I think it's apparent to lots of people, fail so miserably that you're now getting interest. Like I'm so amazed to hear phenomenology and Husserl and these philosophies that were just not part of any scientific discussion. Like nobody, or autopoiesis, right? Varela's thing. That was like some kind of pot smoking hippie stuff if you talked about it even 10 years ago. And now suddenly I'm finding it everywhere. And so I think there's a sense that like, and I'm wondering also your sense in talking to, so many researchers that like there's this emphasis on this interest in consciousness is also opening up the possibility that we're looking at science wrong, that we need a different kind of science because, the physicist view of like, oh, it's all just quarks, you're done. It kind of fails so miserably with this.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I think that some of the paradigms we have are tottering a bit, and work like Levin's suggests that. I was really stunned when Christoph Koch, told me about his psychedelic experiences and his absolute conviction. This is a guy who was working on brains for his whole career. He was head of the Allen Brain Institute, that consciousness was outside of his skull, and he's going down this path of idealist philosophy. So, I think the great thing about the problem of consciousness is it does put pressure on science, and
Yeah.
in an interesting way,
Yeah.
and and I think that's will be one of its legacies to open things up. But I have to say, it was Blind Spot gave me the courage to be critical of the science, and who am I, and to argue with these guys and press them. And a lot of what the second half of the book does is trying to bring phenomenology into the conversation through art, and trying to avoid that word whenever I could, because I think you just lose so many readers every time you use it.
You do. It's true.
You lose 25% of your readers every time you use it,
That and
or
quality.
whatever it was. Yeah.
Yeah.
So Christoph was here for one of my recent think tanks that I do here in Tuscany on rational mysticism. And I had Christoph, I had Carlo Ravelli, Philip Goff, who is the panpsychist,
Yeah.
philosopher, and right. And it was a really interesting conversation, whenever one of them let the other speak. But it was kind of like, because they were so different in so many ways. But I was blown away by Christoph and I mean, this is a profound transformation, and I think it takes a lot of guts for a
Yeah.
well-known scientist to actually say, I screwed up the way I was thinking about the problem I spent most of my life thinking about. And there's this other way of thinking about. And right or wrong, I think it is an example of professional, ethics to kind of say, I'm not going to stick to an idea that I don't think is right anymore. I'm going to go out into the world and say, yep, I took DMT and I took ayahuasca, and my whole take into the nature of reality changed profoundly, so that it's not just what's in my mind, and the idea of embodied is that it is out there, and then of course you have the idealism versus the panpsychism, which is trying to make cosmic intelligence materialistic and reductionistic, which is really weird in my opinion, more than anything else. But I'm saying all this because clearly this notion of bringing this massive ontological shift, to say that conscious is not in us and our bodies, but is actually out there, and we have some sort of receptacle or antenna or whatever you want to call it for this. it's a heavy ontological
Like
Oh
heavy
yeah.
lifting. Yeah. Yeah.
lifting, in order to kind to try to make sense of what's going on.
I've been thinking a lot about this too because I was very enamored of Aldous Huxley's book, The Doors of Perception, and he has this idea, which I guess comes from Henri Bergson, that of the brain as a receiver of consciousness rather
Right.
than a generator of consciousness. It's a very common perception on psychedelics, and there is this sense that you're taking in more consciousness than you usually do. But that doesn't necessarily mean it's coming from outside. Of course, it could be coming from your subconscious. It could be, I mean, we don't know where it's coming from. I
Mm.
think the idea that there is more to be conscious of than we are in our everyday lives, there's a value to that. The ontological status of what that extra thing is or where it really comes from, I think is, really open question. It also just could be simply more sensory information. I mean, we take in a very narrow bandwidth of reality with our senses. And it may be that psychedelics expands that bandwidth in a way that feels like consciousness, more consciousness. But going back to Christoph Koch, I mean, this isn't the first time he's changed his mind. I mean, he realized also early on that the search for neural correlates wasn't really going to do much. And I have enormous admiration for his ability to change his mind because
Yeah.
the saying, science changes one funeral at a time. Because people don't change their minds, and
Well, we all change our mind. Adam did, I did, in our careers, physicists too. I did a PhD in string theory and theories of everything. And to me at the time in my late 20s, that was the heroic scientific journey to go on to. How could we not try to figure everything out into some big equation, right? And nowadays, I find that completely unrealistic
what
from
changed your mind?
what changed my mind was sort of like a deeper dive in epistemology and understanding how science actually works, right? That science works by asking questions about reality. And those questions are both, well, they're expanded through our instruments, they have limitations. And we can only tell a story of what you see of the world, right? And what is being asked by these questions is, by these theories, is that we're going to tell the whole story, and that is what we see of the world. And that's just not right because, 10 years from now, people are going to say, you know what? The Higgs particle is actually made of a fifth force, so it's not a single particle. And you cannot not know, you do not know how to eliminate that possibility from the story of science. So to say you have a end goal that is going to finalize thing to me. That's why Isaiah Berlin as well. He used to say that,
Yeah.
it is kind of a stupid idea to think you can have an absolute answer to a
Anything.
question. And
What you're
so,
saying though reminds me of this idea of apertures, right? I mean that or the reducing valve. I mean, we do that with our science. We're always looking at things through an aperture that could be wider or narrower than it is.
I love the idea also of the in the book, I forget, maybe it's Alice Gopnik who talks about professor consciousness and
Yeah,
how much of the theories, both philosophical and scientific about this, come from a kind of very narrow kind of mind, which often, again, phenomenology, that kind of whole continental philosophy, that just wasn't part of it. Like that kind of, because so much phenomenology ended up being interested in art and literature and all, but not science. And so, yeah, the professor consciousness, since that's dominated the dialogue about what it means to be consciousness, that's a very limited kind of way of
yeah,
thinking for
no,
the
that
same
was kind of
time.
mind blowing. That I should pay attention to the kind of consciousness of people who study consciousness. And it's really getting at something important that I mean, look, science, pretends to this God's eye view, and but these are individuals, and they're a certain kind of individual who can sit in chairs for a very long time thinking about the same thing, and that's not most of us. So yeah, she at various points in my journey, she said things were like, oh yeah, I got to think about that. She's wonderful that way and generous too.
I had a conversation with an anthropologist a few months ago. David Dupuy is his name, and he does research on ayahuasca. And so he's gone, down into Brazil and the Amazon and done ayahuasca numerous times and interviewed people and studied the practice of using it. And I've never done it, so I have no experiential insight into it. But one of the things he said that really struck me is he said one of the things that's particular about ayahuasca, and you may know this already, Michael, but is that when you've taken it, you have the experience of communicating with other beings, and they present as outside you. They're transcendent. They're other beings in the in the cosmos. And then 3 months later, you take ayahuasca again, and you go right back to the conversation where it left off with those beings. And the default materialist way of trying to explain that in terms of something being generated by the brain as a physical system under the influence of the action of the active ingredients in ayahuasca. I mean, that's part of the story, obviously, but that just seems so, impoverished as a way of accounting for, we'll use the word, the phenomenology of this unique experience of being in communication with beings who clearly present as outside you and are picking up right where they left off, saying, well, what have you been doing for the last 3 months? Did you follow my advice? Did you take, take these instructions? I mean, that's amazing, right? So
Yeah, it is.
that was what Huxley was talking about, when he said mind at large and the brain as this kind of, refracting prism or reducing valve of something that's just much vaster. And I like that idea. I actually write about this idea in a book about dying that I've just completed, The Experience of Dying. I like the idea because it's actually relational. It's this idea that there's a larger cosmos, and the brain is generative of how it presents to you, but it isn't productive of the full dimensionality of the experience.
And it also makes sense that we would have access to only the information we need to survive.
Right, right,
Kind of Donald Hoffman's idea, that our perceptions don't necessarily present the whole world or everything that's out there. It's just what we need, and
right, exactly.
what Huxley called the measly trickle of information we
Right.
need.
For survival on the planet. That's right.
And
That
this
was his.
interspecies communication is a very typical. It's not just ayahuasca because I've experienced with mescaline, which actually Aldous Huxley, his
That's
book
what
is
he
called Laws of Perception for a reason, right? I mean, he's talking about just basically this unfocusing that I was mentioning before, and with mescaline, just recently, I and my wife, we were truly communicating with bees in a way, in a very, our faces are right in the middle of this huge amount of bees, and everybody was happy. No problem. And we were like listening to them and poking our eyes in the middle of these flowers, and they were just, okay, no problem. You can just be here. And we were like, I have no idea how long we spent doing that, but it was something that I would never do, let's say, sober. So it does open this
Yeah.
unfocusing relationship to other ways of looking at the world, which I don't know if they are good evolutionary or not, but they're definitely enriching for our inner lives in very powerful ways.
Well, on that point of what is the value of these experiences, well, I have a couple things to say. One is I think William James had a good in varieties of religious experience when he talks about mystical experiences that we really can't judge the veracity of what these people are reporting to us, divine encounters and encounters with other beings, but we should treat them as hypotheses and subject them to other ways of knowing. And I think that's a healthy way to think about it. And that's what I tried to do because I had this experience on psilocybin that the plants in my garden were conscious. And my first instinct was throw it out, drug-addled perception. And then my second instinct was, well, let's see if anyone takes this seriously. And what would that mean for plants to be conscious? So I think if you see psychedelic experience as a generator of hypotheses, of questions, that's valuable. Yeah, and it's a good way to think about it. But for Christoph, he completely accepted it, and
And ran with it. Yeah.
and ran with it. Yeah, I mean, we'll see where it takes him. I think he is paying some reputational price. I hear snickers about this experience that he had, but more power to him.
But along those lines, just in the last 8 minutes or so, just to also bring the other way of altering your consciousness, which is contemplative practice. So, I love the ending of the book in the cave, because I also, the year before you were there, I spent 5 days in the cave. And for the people who
Oh,
don't
you
know,
did?
yeah, yeah, and it was transformative. So Roshi Joan Halifax, who is the abbot of the Opaya Zen Center, has land up in the hills or the mountains. I don't know which mountains those are. The Sierra something.
Sangre de Cristo.
Sangre de
Yeah,
Cristo, yeah.
up at about 10,000 feet. And getting up there is an unbelievable journey. They just, typical Joan Halifax, she just pushed me into a Jeep, a four-wheel, and said, "You'll do fine," as you have to do these almost vertical. It was huge
And
fun,
you're
but
on a
also
dirt road for like
with
miles.
mud, and it was just
Yeah.
anyway. So the cave is about a mile from where Joan has her, and there's not many people up there. Usually it's just Joan and Wendy, her sort of attendant. And there's a few houses, and there's two caves, two rooms that were dug into the mountain with a glass. They're rooms basically with a glass wall front. And yeah, they're meditation spaces. And so both Michael and I spent like 5 days in there. And you were talking, I listened to your interview with Ezra Klein, and you were talking about the idea of how much the meditation just became sweeping in the morning. You get up and you make your breakfast, and then you sweep out the cave, and then you chop your wood. And then, because I've always had a thing for hermits, the Zen hermits are my heroes. So this idea that contemplative practice as a means of opening this larger space, this space that at some point science just will not be able to enter, that there's what I think what contemplative practice sort of opens you up to is that, as in Wittgenstein's seventh proposition, that which cannot be spoken of must be passed over in silence. What contemplative practice shows you is, yeah, just because you're passing over it doesn't mean there's nothing to do with it. And, so I think that's another way of opening up to the idea that there's much more to consciousness than just the rational mind or the discursive mind. So
Yeah, no, meditation, I mean, it also just teaches you how strange the mind is. I mean, I, you can't account for some of the thoughts
oh,
you have or the images you have. And, it becomes pretty clear you're not thinking them. They're thinking themselves.
right, right.
And how does that work? So yeah, I mean, I find it in an everyday encounter with with the strange for me. And but it was intensified there because, as you say, it wasn't just sitting on that platform. It was everything you did became a meditation, and there was a space opened up because there was so little to do. There's so little you could do,
Right.
and the silence was so absolute
You're in
that,
silence, you are alone, right?
yeah, very alone. And it makes you also realize how much your sense of self is a product of social interaction, and
Exactly.
that we are constantly enforcing each other's sense that, oh, you must be a self. I'm talking to you, and someone's talking to me. I must be a self. And the membrane gets more permeable, I think, when you have that kind of complete solitude.
And there was just the meadow, there was that meadow down from that, somehow
It's quite
that became,
beautiful.
oh, it's incredibly, and that
And there were
became
animals
another.
there. I don't, what time of year were you there?
It was probably May, late May.
Yeah.
And
So, which is early spring up there.
right, right. It was
Yeah,
still quite
I
cold.
was
And
there a little later, and the trees were just leafing out. It's a very late.
So did you feel like in the cave that because there was no one else, and that, did you feel like your sense of conversation with other kinds of realities was expanded because you still need to converse with somebody or something,
Yeah,
right? I was
yeah, and
wondering.
you're in relation. You're
Yeah,
always in relation with something.
that's
I
the
mean,
thing.
I describe at the beginning, I talked to myself a lot.
Yeah, I was going to ask.
Yeah, and I think that's the default, right? But after a while, that fell silent, and a lot of it was the landscape, and then this moment of, I mean, the stars up there on a clear night are extraordinary, and I just had a very, the valve open really wide looking at these stars. I mean, there was no light pollution at all, and you had a sense that they were, you know, at every possible point in space, not just on a scrim, all at the same distance with different intensity. They were actually in different places relative to me. So there was
Yeah, they're
that
not
sense.
just above you, they're behind you also, right?
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
and this, I described this intergalactic blanket that,
It's a
was,
web.
because the negative space, there was a lot going on in the negative space, and I took no psychedelics.
Yeah.
Yeah, it sounds pretty trippy, but
You don't need to. No.
no, you don't need to. You don't need to. And I think that we see historically there's a natural transition from psychedelics to meditation. And if you look at, Joan is one example, but
Yeah.
many other Buddhists who I've interviewed, the people who really brought Buddhism to America too, Jack Kornfeld and
Mhm.
Sharon Salzberg, and all these people, they all had a psychedelic phase, and they were looking for a way to continue that exploration of consciousness in a daily way, because you can't use psychedelics every day. It's not a practice. I've found now most of these people are happy to talk about it, in a way that they were very quiet
Yeah.
about it for a while. Although, as I say, Joan, one of the reasons I went to the cave is Joan wanted to get me off the property. I'm convinced. because all her students, all the young monks wanted to talk to me about psychedelics, and, and which she regards as a shortcut, probably rightly so. So I think
Many,
that's one of
many
the reasons
monks
I
do.
was in the cave. By the
Joan
way,
is great. Joan will
I'm
just
seeing her
push
in
you.
London for
That's what I
lunch.
love about Joan. Joan is like, what's amazing about Joan Halifax is she's the most loving, like she just emanates this warmth and loving kindness, but she will also push you off the deep end of the pool
Oh
and then
yeah.
walk away if she thinks that's what you need as a student. Yeah, just
Well,
goodbye. You're fine. Don't worry.
there's a toughness about her, without question.
She's a force. Truly, I just one of the few people I would say is a force of nature.
Yes,
I've known her since I was 12 years old.
yeah.
She and my dad were very close friends. So yeah.
Really? So that was probably the psychedelic time.
Yeah, but my dad was never into psychedelics. He was very critical
Really?
of it. He was an
Really.
outlier in that way. He was very into meditation, spirituality, and
Interesting.
but he was very critical of psychedelics. He didn't like it. He thought it was a kind of shortcut detour kind of
Well,
thing.
the way they were being
Um,
used then too. I mean,
yeah,
that was
Exactly.
probably
I was gonna
early
say,
Very little
70s.
intention. Yeah.
Yeah,
yeah,
very
yeah.
But
little intention. That's exactly
her
it.
her
Right,
phase was when she was married to Stan Groff, which
right, right.
would have been the
Exactly.
mid-70s, I think.
Yeah, yeah. That's right. That's when I first met her. Was mid 70s in that phase. Yeah.
but things are changing a lot now, right? And we just as we're recording, it's just a few days after Trump signed that order, right? Which I don't know how much practical power that has, but it does say something about an openness. I would say that's the only decent thing he's done in
Yeah.
office since he took office. But it is interesting that this is happening. A lot of this community that is saying, there is tremendous amount of therapeutic power to these medicines. And it can help a lot of people. It's kind of a good thing, I have to
I
say.
think it's a good thing. I think his reasons for doing it, were basically about getting Joe Rogan back in the tent. Um, I mean, honestly, I think it was a very cynical move on his part. But people do good things for bad reasons, and um, I think it'll help. I think it'll give more momentum. There is more research to be done. There is the enormous potential to heal people here. One of the interesting things in the psychedelic world is that by doing things to help veterans, in particular, with all the work on trauma, that's changed the whole reputation of psychedelics, which have been coded liberal or left.
Right.
But now
Interesting.
you have Republicans like Rick Perry and that are very supportive, and one of the reasons is because there's such potential to help soldiers who are, veterans are committing suicide at terrifying numbers.
Yeah.
So I think we're getting away from that idea that psychedelics is a left phenomenon, and I think that's healthy.
And there is this dive, just to kind of like we have to end soon, but just this dive into this notion that there is this neuroplasticity, these windows of shaping up, right, the brain, which I think that to me is incredibly fascinating, that there is this window that you can open, with meditation, but also with these medicines, and which kind of gives hope, right, to a lot of people to say, I'm not stuck in the
Right.
way I am right now, but I can actually transform myself, not just emotionally, but actually structurally in my mind.
Yeah, I know. I think that is one of the most exciting and hopeful things about psychedelics is that they do create this window for change. And Gul Dolan, who is now at Berkeley, works on these critical periods of learning, and she's mostly working with animals. Although she now has an experiment with stroke patients to see whether the critical period to relearn various physical functions can be opened with, I think, psilocybin in that case. And that would be enormously, I mean, that it works for physical phenomenon as well as mental phenomena would be
That would be
incredible.
amazing. Yeah.
Yeah,
She's the one that gave, I think, MDMA to octopus or something
that's
like that,
right. Yeah.
and they changed behavior big time,
Yeah, they
which
became much more social.
yeah,
Um, they're
It's a
normally completely
jerks.
yeah,
solitary
isolation, yeah.
creatures, and she gave them a choice of chambers, one where they could hang out with other octopuses and one where they could be alone. And for several weeks after their MDMA dose, they chose the social chamber.
The social one.
Yeah.
So that tells you a lot about animal intelligence, right? And animal consciousness as well. That they're responding, even a completely different animal from us, is still responding to the same chemistry in similar ways.
Yeah, and such a different creature, right? I mean,
Right.
with, distributed brain and I mean, all this. I mean, the fact that it worked in that case was extraordinary. What were you going to say, Adam?
Well, just that probably because we should probably end. I just wanted to maybe end on your, thinking about like so this the book is about consciousness, but it's also, as we've talked about, it's really about science itself and our worldviews. Where now, not only now that the book is done, but also you've seen the response to it. I mean, I'm just wondering where you think both the science of consciousness, the science of science itself, all the things, like in the occur in the blind spot. What's your reading of where we are now? And maybe that's a good place to close up.
Yeah. So the thing I was on tour for like 5 weeks and talked to I don't know how many thousands of people, and there was always a question period. Um, I think people have a real concern about AI. I think there's a lot of anxiety around AI, which is multifaceted. I mean, there's the fear of loss of employment. There's the idea of conscious creatures, the idea of no longer being the smartest creature on Earth. Um, and I think, I say in the book that we may be arriving at this Copernican moment of redefinition of what the human is. And because you have two things going on at the same time, you've got AI, if it isn't actually conscious, convincing millions of people it is, which is
Right.
already happening, right? People are
Right.
forming emotional bonds with machines, which is an extraordinary thing. And then on the other side, you have this democratization of consciousness. I mean, we're finding it in more and more different species. It used to just be primates, not that long ago, and maybe dolphins, and now it's like widespread. So I think that there's some anxiety about this, but maybe excitement too about figuring out who we are and what makes us special. So that's on people's minds. And the other is this, I talked a lot on the road about the pollution of consciousness and what which is about, I think, the sense many people have that their heads are full of bullshit, basically. I mean, between Trump and his ability to command our attention, social media, and the fact that we spend so much time thinking other people's thoughts, and they're not exactly thoughts on social media, um, and that this sense that maybe I could reclaim this wonderful private space of mental freedom where you can think whatever you want, and that we're squandering it, and people I think want to have more sovereignty there than they have right now, and these algorithms have figured out ways to really burrow deep into our consciousness, and in ways we don't fully understand yet, and it's going to get a lot worse with AI. So so I think this idea of like, well, what do you do to, what's consciousness hygiene look like, is something that is I talked about a lot and seem to resonate with people. But as to where I go next, I don't know. I mean, I'm doing a short thing on the microbiome, which is seems totally disconnected, except it's also part of the same project of like
Yeah.
mind body problem. What
Yeah.
do you
Yeah.
It's part
Now
of the
it's not your
mind.
body.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is part of the mind, and people call it the second brain. It was probably the first brain.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's
That's
in the
right.
gut before anything else. You have the gut feeling, right?
Yeah.
And then
Gut feeling, yeah.
what is
So
that?
there's all this interesting research about, about the gut brain connection, and it's also full of mystery. I mean, it's one of those. The more I burrow into that too, nobody knows anything.
As long as you manage to rescue our
Good.
humanity through all that, we're good.
Yeah.
That's to me what's really essential. Let's make sure we don't lose sense of who we are in the process.
Yeah, I think it's so important, and I think it's going to be challenging in the next few years.
Yeah.
Well, thank you guys. What a pleasure to talk to you, and thank you again for your work. The Blind Spot, I tell everybody about it. I encourage any scientist I know to read it,
Thank
and
you.
it's just such an important intervention. And I know now you're going to figure out what science should be, and
Post
I'm
blind spot.
That's the hope. That's the hope. Well, thanks for the encouragement. It means a lot to us.
We
yeah.
are
All
going
right,
to
keep up the
beyond the
great work.
blind spot now. So that's it. Next time you come, we're going to talk about beyond the blind spot.
That's what
Right.
it is.
All right, I'll be eager for that.
All right, everybody. Well,
All right,
well,
guys.
thank you, everyone.
Okay.
Thank you so
care.
much.
Thanks,
Thank you,
Michael.
See you
Michael.
guys. See you next time.
Take care.